Negative painting is an important technique for watercolor painting. If you're not familiar with negative painting, it's a technique that you paint around the subject rather than the subject itself. Today, I'm going to share with you 5 ways I use negative painting for my watercolor art. Because watercolor medium is transparent, we need to use negative painting in order to paint the background. Because I want a soft-looking background, so I use clear water to wet the paper first, and then I use charging technique by dropping my transparent gold dip and my green mixture on the paper. In this painting, my background is a bit complicated because I have orange blossom in the background and it's also white color. That led us to my second way of using negative painting, is using negative painting to paint white subject, which we will apply to our white blossom, white butterfly and white feather. I use negative painting to paint very lightly around the butterfly. The butterfly that I choose for this painting is very simple. It has white on the top part of the wings and very light yellow on the bottom part. To create an illusion of depth and movement, I make sure that the wing that's closest to us is a bit clearer and more defined, and the wing that stay further away is blurry and blend into the background. With wet on dry technique, I use my brown mixture to add a few strokes on the wings to create the pattern of the butterfly's wings. And then I add a few brown dots on the butterfly's wing, and just like that, our butterfly is finished. Now it's time to start with our orange blossom. The petals of orange blossom are white colors, the stamens are yellow and the stems are greens. So we had to depend on negative painting around those white petals. By painting those little green stems that connect the flower buds to the main orange stems, it helped me to define the petals of the blossom. If you pay close attention, white subjects always contains colors, the colors that reflect from its surrounding and the shadow. For example, the inner part of the petals showing a bit of yellow, that's because it's getting color reflections from the stamen. Getting back to the butterfly to paint the antenna wet on dry technique. I find negative painting very fascinating. By painting those white blossom and the leaves behind the birds, we are shaping the birds at the same time. Using my greenish gray mixture, paint in the shading area on the petals to give them a bit of texture and dimension. Sometimes I don't use negative painting to create white subject, I use lifting technique instead, such as these little white feather behind the birds. They are so tiny and soft looking. So lifting technique is easier to get this effect. Because I want my background to look soft and blurry, so I use charging technique again to create the rest of the background. Because the legs of the birds are very skinny, so if the pigment get into the area that you don't want it, you also can use lifting technique to lift up the paint. It's time to let my painting dry before I work on the bird. Number 3 is I use negative painting technique to paint in the shadow area. In this case, I paint in the shadow of the feather. With wet into wet technique, I paint in the shadow area of the feather. Using negative painting to paint in the shadow area, it helps to shape and define the feather that stay on the top. This technique creates soft texture and it's enough to show the feather separation on the fairywren's tail. Another example is the shadow underneath the wing. I paint the feather texture very loosely because I want the concentration to be on the eyes and the beak. With wet on damp technique, I add darker pigment to the wings of the fairywren, and then I paint in the casting shadow underneath the wing, leaving a bit of white gap in between for the highlight. In order to mimic the soft texture of the tiny little feather on the chest and the belly of the fairywren, I apply clear water first and then work on wet into wet technique. I make sure each brush stroke follows the direction of the feather. The shadow underneath the wing get a little bit lighter after the water evaporates, so I add another layer. Because there aren't a lot of color over here, so getting my value correctly is very important to create three-dimensional look. By painting the rest in color, we have shaped the silhouette of tiny white feather on the chest of fairywren. I'm sorry if you could hear some noises in the background. There's a lot of construction site going on in my area. Painting the eyes and the beak of the birds are my favorite part. And I love to create those tiny little highlights to show the glossy surface. Which leads us to my fourth way of using negative painting to shape tiny highlights. If you find those tiny highlights is too small for your negative painting, you also have another option is to use white gouache. Finally, I get to paint my favorite part of the birds. I'm using my brown mixture to paint the bottom of the eye, leaving a bit of the highlight, and then get the top of the eye a bit darker. I make sure this eye looks clear, defined, and realistic, while the other side of the eye stays in less focus. I use cadmium-free red and transparent gold dip to create orange mixture for those tiny feathers around both eyes. This area I use wet on dry technique because I want the texture to be clear and defined. If you have subscribed to my channel for a while, you probably realize that I have painted fairywren a few times already. But I still enjoy painting them. Painting the same subject makes me learn a lot. Each time I paint fairywren, I find myself painting them differently, especially when they are standing in a different position. So this is the last tidy up. When everything is dry, I use wet on dry technique to add another layer to those areas that needs to be darker. Believe it or not, I haven't touched my brush for 3 months. And this is my first painting after 3 months break. That's why I start with a small scale of painting on an A5 size. Even though this painting is so tiny, but it involves tons of technique that could warm me up and get me back into my watercolor world. I use the same orange mixture that I paint those feathers around the eyes to paint the legs of the fairywren. Those legs are very tiny and skinny, so I use one coat of orange and then I use my brown mixture to paint in the shading area. You might see this area of the leg looks almost disconnected. I did this on purpose because I want to create those tiny details of sunlight hitting on the leg. This tiny attention of detail doesn't overwhelm the viewer's eye. Instead, it helps to create interest for the painting without me trying hard. If you enjoy this content, dropping me some comment, like, and subscription will encourage me to create some more content like this for you.